I have stood beside Corporal Emeric Vale for 4 years, and in all that time I never once saw the little iron cross leave the inside of his collar. He wore it against the skin over his heart, on a plain cord gone gray with washing, and he tucked it under the wool of his tunic each morning, the way another man might check that his boots were laced. It was not part of the uniform. It was not permitted by the uniform, strictly speaking, and the sergeants who knew about it looked the other way, because there are things a disciplined man is owed, and one of them is the right to carry his grief where he can feel it. The day the gangster came for it, the forecourt of Harrogate was crowded with the ordinary noise of a summer afternoon, tourists 3 deep at the black railings, 100 phones lifted like a field of little bright leaves, the shuffle of feet on the cobblestones, a child somewhere laughing at the pigeons. Emeric and I held the sentry boxes flanking the east gate. We did not move. That is the work. To the crowd we were 2 red statues under 2 tall bearskins, white-gloved hands on our rifles, chins level, eyes fixed on a middle distance that never changes. They photograph us the way they photograph the stone lions, as though we were made of the same thing and could feel nothing, and would be there forever whether they came or went. Most of them are kind. Most of them stand at the line and marvel and take their picture and drift on. And if a boy makes a face to try and break us, well, we have seen every face there is, and none of them has ever won. But there is always, in a crowd, one man who has decided that the rules that bind other men are a kind of joke, and that the proof of his own size is how much he can take from someone who is not allowed to take anything back. His name I would learn later. That afternoon I knew him only as the loud one, a big man in an expensive gray tracksuit, gold at both wrists, and a heavy ring on every other finger, a phone held out by a thin, nervous friend who filmed everything he did. He had the walk of a man who owned the pavement he stood on, and a laugh he used like a fist, throwing it out ahead of himself so the crowd would turn. He wanted the crowd to turn. Everything he did was for the lens. He started the way they all start, close to the line, leaning over it, saying things at Emeric's face to see if the face would answer. Come on, blink, say something. You're not really a soldier, are you? You're a doll. Look at him, he's a doll. His friend laughed on cue. A few tourists laughed too, uneasily, the way people laugh when a bigger dog than theirs starts barking. Emeric did what we are trained to do, which is nothing. He looked through the man at the middle distance, and his breath went in and out slow and even, and the little iron cross lay warm against his heart where none of them could see it. I want to tell you what that stillness costs, because the crowd never sees it and the man in the tracksuit certainly never guessed it. It is not that we feel nothing. It is that we have agreed, each of us, on the day we took the post, to carry what we feel without spending it. A man leans into your face and calls you a doll, and everything in your body that is still an animal wants to answer him, and you take that wanting, and you set it down, and you go on breathing. Every hour of every watch is that same small act repeated, until the muscles of it are stronger than the man himself. Emeric was the best of us at it. I had seen drunks scream in his ear, and seen a woman throw a full cup of coffee across his tunic, and seen a boy on a dare flick the peak of his bearskin, and I had never once seen the discipline slip. So I was not worried at first. I thought this was another loud one who would tire of a wall that would not talk back and move along and be forgotten by supper. Then he saw the cord. It was the smallest thing. Emeric had marched the changing of the guard an hour before, and in the heat the collar of his tunic had loosened by a finger's width, and the gray cord had risen just above the wool at the side of his throat, a thin, worn line of it, no more. To anyone else it was nothing, a bootlace, a thread. But the man in the tracksuit had run out of ways to make the doll flinch, and here at last was a seam in the perfect surface, a thing that belonged to the man and not to the uniform, and men like him have a nose for exactly that. They cannot bear a stillness they have not broken, so they hunt for the one thing that will break it. "What's this then?" he said, and his voice changed, lower, delighted, the voice of a man who has found the soft place. "You've got a little necklace on, look at that. The doll's got a little necklace." He turned to the lens. "Health and safety, that. Can't have that on parade, can we?" And he reached across the black railing, over the line that every sign in 3 languages tells them not to cross, and hooked one thick finger under the gray cord at Emeric's throat. I felt the whole forecourt change. You learn to feel it on the post the moment a crowd stops being an audience and becomes a thing that could tip either way. The laughter guttered out. A woman near the railing said no asterisk under her breath to no one. The thin friend with the phone stopped grinning and kept filming, because he did not know what else to do. And Emeric, I was watching him. I was 2 boxes away and watching him the whole time. Emeric did not move. His eyes stayed on the middle distance. His hands stayed on the rifle. But I saw the cord go tight against the back of his neck as the man pulled, and I saw the muscles stand out along Emeric's jaw, and I understood in a cold rush what the man had his finger hooked under and did not know it. He pulled. He meant, I think, only to lift it out into the light and dangle it and make a show. Look what the doll hides. Look what I found. But the cord was old and it had been washed 1,000 times, and it had held a man's whole grief for 6 years. And when he yanked it, the knot at the back gave way, and the little iron cross came free into his fat, bearinged hand, and he lifted it up over his head for the crowd and the camera like a fisherman lifting a catch. "There we go," he crowed. "Confiscated, that's mine now." And Emeric moved. Not the way you are imagining. He did not swing the rifle. He did not strike. In 4 years I had learned to read the smallest shifts in him, and what I saw was not a soldier attacking. It was a man whose heart had just been torn out of his collar in front of 200 strangers, and who was holding himself together by a thread thinner than the one that had just broken. His head turned. That was all at first. His head turned, and for the first time in the whole watch his eyes came off the middle distance and landed on the man's hand, on the little iron cross swinging from the man's fingers, and the look on Emeric's face was not anger. It was worse than anger. It was the look of someone watching a thing he cannot lose being lost. "Give it back," Emeric said. 2 words. The crowd gasped, not at the words but at the fact of them, because to them the statue had spoken, the doll had a voice, and the phone swung as one toward his face. But I did not hear a statue. I heard a crack running through the middle of a man, and I stepped out of my box, because whatever came next I was not going to let him face it alone. The man in the tracksuit laughed, and it was an ugly laugh now because he had won and he knew it, and winning had made him cruel. "Oh, it talks," he said. "It wants its necklace. What is it, eh? What's so special?" He held it higher, turning it in the sun so the little cross caught the light, so the crowd could see it was nothing, a rough iron thing, hand-cut, no bigger than a thumb, with something scratched into the face of it too small to read from where they stood. "It's a bit of scrap," he announced. "It's rubbish. Look at it. The great big soldiers crying over a bit of scrap." He was playing to the lens the whole time, and the lens was drinking it. And somewhere in the back of the crowd, I heard a boy laugh, and I hated that boy for a second, though he was only a boy and knew nothing. Emeric took 1 step toward the railing. 1. And then he stopped himself, and I watched him stop himself, and it was the hardest thing I ever saw a man do, because the post holds even here. The post holds especially here. A royal guard does not vault a railing and lay hands on a member of the public, not for any provocation, not for the worst thing in the world, because the moment he does, he is no longer the discipline, he is only another man in a brawl, and everything the uniform stands for goes down into the cobblestones with him. Emeric knew that better than I did. So he stood at the railing with his heart in a stranger's fist, and he did not climb over, and he said again, quieter, so that only the front row and the camera caught it, "Please, it's not scrap. Give it back to me, please." And that "please," that word from that man in that voice, I think it is what saved him in the end, because a dozen strangers who had been laughing stopped laughing all at once. You do not hear a royal guard say "*please*". You do not hear that word cost a man so much. Something in the sound of it turned the crowd the way a wind turns, and for the first time the tracksuit man was not the biggest thing in the forecourt. He had made a soldier beg, and instead of the crowd loving him for it, the crowd had begun, very quietly, to hate him. He did not feel it yet. Men like him never feel it until it is far too late. He grinned and looped the gray cord around his own thick neck, settling the little iron cross against his gold chains as though it were a trophy. "Suits me better anyway," he said. "Finders keepers, soldier. Come and get it." And he spread his arms wide, daring the doll to break the rule that was the only thing holding the doll in one piece. I had my hand near my radio. I want to be honest about that. Every instinct I was screaming to call it in, to bring the sergeant of the guard and the palace police down on this man's head. And I would, in about 90 seconds, and it would matter. But in that moment I did the other thing my training told me to do, which was to move to my brother's side, to put my own red shoulder next to his at the railing, so that whatever this became, there were two of us and not one. I stepped up beside Emeric. I did not speak to the man. I looked at him the way we are taught to look, the level look that costs nothing and says everything, and I let him understand that the doll had a partner, and the partner was watching, and the partner had a radio. For half a second something flickered behind the man's eyes. Then his pride ate it the way pride does, and he laughed louder to bury it. "Two of them now," he told the camera. "Reinforcements. What are you going to do? Blink at me together." That was when the child spoke. She was small at the front of the crowd, holding her grandmother's hand. I never learned her name, and she has nothing to do with the rest of this except that she said the true thing when no adult would. She looked up at the big man with the cross around his neck, and she said, in the clear carrying voice that only the very young have, "That's not yours. You took it." And she was not frightened, and she was not performing. She simply saw a theft and named it, the way children do before the world teaches them to be quiet about such things. For one beat the whole forecourt held its breath, and the man in the tracksuit, who could stand against 100 phones and 2 silent guards, could not stand against one small, honest sentence, because it was the truth and it had been spoken aloud, and now everyone had heard it and there was no laughing it off. His face went a dull red. "Shut up," he said to the child, to a child, and the word landed in the crowd like a stone in still water, and I watched the last of his audience turn against him in a single silent motion, 200 faces going cold at once. He should have run then. If he had had any sense left, he would have thrown the cross down and run for the crowd's edge and been 3 streets away before anyone thought to stop him. But he was not built to retreat. Retreat was the one thing his whole life had trained him against. So instead he turned his temper on the source of the truth, and he took a step toward the railing, toward the guard he had robbed, and he jabbed a bearing finger an inch from Emeric's face. "You put her up to that," he snarled. "You and your little sob story. It's a bit of iron, it's junk. You want to see what I think of your precious junk." And he took the little iron cross in his fist, and he made as if to throw it, to hurl it out over the heads of the crowd, onto the cobblestones, under 100 careless feet, gone. I have replayed the next 4 seconds more times than I can count, and they still happen faster than I can tell them. Emeric's hand came off his rifle. Not to strike, I need you to understand that, because the camera would later make it look like something it was not. His hand came off his rifle and closed around the man's wrist, the throwing wrist, before the cross could leave his fingers. It was not a blow. It was a catch. It was the exact economical motion of a man who has been trained for years to stop a threatening arm without harming the person it belongs to. And he did it so cleanly, so completely without violence, that the man's fist simply stopped in the air as though it had struck a wall, the cross still safe inside it. "You do not throw it," Emeric said. His voice had gone very quiet and very level, and it was somehow more frightening than any shout. "You do not throw it. You will hand it back to me. Now." The man tried to wrench free and could not. He was the bigger man by 2 stone, and he could not move his wrist an inch, and I saw the understanding arrive in his eyes at last, the understanding that the doll was not a doll, that under the ceremonial wool there was a real soldier with a real soldier's strength and a real soldier's training, and that he, the loud man, the big man, had made a terrible mistake with the wrong person. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. And that is the exact moment. I have watched the footage. The whole world has watched the footage that the sergeant of the guard arrived. His name was Sergeant Halloran, and he came at a march from the guardroom with 4 palace police behind him, because I had, in fact, keyed my radio the moment the child spoke, and the call had gone out clean and calm the way we drill it. East Gate, member of the public over the line, theft from a guardsman, request assistance immediate. 90 seconds, no more, from the word to the boots. That is the thing the loud man never counted on. He thought he stood in front of 2 red statues and a crowd of tourists. He did not understand that he stood inside a system, that the 2 statues were the visible edge of a machine with 100 moving parts and one purpose, and that he had just reached across the line and put his hand on that machine, and that the machine had already, quietly, closed around him. "Release him, Corporal," Sergeant Halloran said, and Emeric released the wrist at once, instant, total obedience, the hand back on the rifle, the eyes forward, the discipline snapping shut over the grief like a visor coming down. It was the most controlled thing I have ever seen. In the space of one order he went from a man about to break to a soldier at attention, and only I, who had watched the whole of it, knew what that cost. The palace police did the rest. It was not dramatic, whatever the loud man had imagined for himself. There was no brawl, no crowd surging, none of the chaos he seemed to need. 2 officers took him by the arms with the bored efficiency of men who do this every week, and a 3rd recited the words of the thing, and a 4th stood between the man and the crowd, and it was all over in less time than it takes to tell. He was cautioned for crossing the security line, and cautioned for the theft, and because the child's clear voice and my radio call and 200 filming phones had made the facts of it impossible to argue. He was cautioned, too, for what he had said and done to a member of the public, which was the child. "It's a necklace," he kept saying as they turned him toward the gate. "It's a bit of scrap. All this over a bit of scrap." He said it to the officers, and he said it to the crowd, and he said it to the phones, and no one answered him, and the not answering was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. He had spent his whole life being the loudest thing in every room. Now he was being carried out of one, and the room had already forgotten him, and its whole attention had turned instead to the man in red at the railing, and to the small iron cross that Sergeant Halloran now lifted, very carefully, from the officer's open palm. Because they had recovered it, that was the first thing. Before anything else was understood, the cross was recovered. The gray cord retrieved from around the man's thick neck, the little iron thing lifted out of the mess of gold chains, and Sergeant Halloran held it up to the light and looked at it, and I watched his face change the way a face changes when a man reads a name he was not expecting to read. Because there was a name on it. That was the thing none of the crowd could see from the railing, the thing the loud man had mistaken for scratches, for junk, for scrap. Someone had cut a name into the face of that iron cross by hand, letter by careful letter, and under the name a date, and under the date 2 words. And Sergeant Halloran read them, standing in the middle of the forecourt with the crowd gone silent around him. And then he did a thing that no one in that forecourt had ever seen a sergeant of the guard do. He came to attention, he turned to face Emeric, and he saluted him. Now, a sergeant of the guard does not salute a corporal. The salute runs the other way. It always has. It is one of the oldest and most fixed things in the whole of our world. For Halloran to bring his hand up to a corporal in front of the changing crowd was so far outside the order of things that the tourists who understood any of our customs actually gasped, and the ones who understood none of them simply felt the weight of it and fell quiet. Emeric stood there at the railing, and I saw his throat move, and I saw him make the decision, quick, disciplined, to return the salute, guardsman to sergeant, and not to weep, though I do not think there was a man among us who would have thought less of him if he had. "I'll hold it for you until you're off watch, Corporal," Halloran said, low, only for us. "It'll be safe with me, on my life." And he closed the little cross in his fist, and he carried it back toward the guardroom himself, and he did not hand it to anyone. The crowd did not disperse. That was the strange thing. Ordinarily, a scene like that ends and the tourists drift off to the next attraction, the excitement spent. But this crowd stayed at the railing, murmuring, and I could feel the question moving through it like a current. What was it? What did the sergeant read? Why did he salute? The phones were still up, but they had turned from hunger to something gentler, people filming not to catch a soldier breaking now, but to hold on to a thing they sensed was larger than they had understood. A woman at the front was crying and did not seem to know why. That is what the truth does when it walks into a place expecting to be laughed at. It changes the temperature of the whole room. Emeric returned to his post. He squared his shoulders, and he set his eyes back on the middle distance, and he stood his watch, because the watch does not end for grief, and it does not end for a stolen heart, and it does not end because the crowd is weeping. He stood it to the last minute of the hour, immaculate, unmoving, the empty place at his collar the only sign that anything at all had happened. I stood my own box beside him, and I matched him breath for breath, and I have never in my life been prouder of another man. It was only later in the guardroom off watch that I learned the whole of the thing, that all of us learned it, because the story of the cross had never been fully told, not even to me, in 4 years of standing at Emeric's side. He had carried it the way you carry a wound that has closed over, present, permanent, private. It took a stranger's cruelty to tear it open, and once it was open, Emeric decided, I think, that it should be told properly, all of it, so that the name cut into the iron would mean to the rest of us what it had always meant to him. The name on the cross was Tobias Wren. Tobias Wren had been Emeric's friend. More than a friend, the word we use, when we mean it truly, is brother asterisk, and they had been that. They had come up together, the two of them, from the same gray town in the same lean year, 2 boys with nothing who had joined the same regiment on the same day, because neither could imagine doing the hard thing without the other beside him. Emeric told it plainly, without ornament, sitting on the bench in the guardroom with his cap in his hands, and the plainness of it was what undid us. Tobias was the braver of the two, he said. Tobias was the one who made the others laugh on the worst nights. Tobias was the one who, when a younger recruit was failing and about to be broken and sent home, would quietly stay up half the night drilling with him in the dark so that the boy would pass the next day's inspection and keep his place. He couldn't stand to see a man left behind, Emeric said. It was the one thing he couldn't do, leave a man behind. They had served together for 6 years. And then, on a duty that Emeric would not describe in detail, and that we did not ask him to, a duty in a hard place, far from any palace, where the work was not ceremonial at all. There had come a day when a thing went wrong, and men were caught on the wrong side of it, and someone had to go back for them. He went back, Emeric said. Of course he went back. It was the one thing he could not do. He turned the empty cord over in his fingers. Halloran had given him back the cross by then, and he held it now, and the iron caught the guardroom light. He got them out, all of them. Every man he went back for came home. He was the last one, and he was almost clear, and then he wasn't. Emeric stopped. The room was very quiet. I was there. I had my hand out for him. I've spent 6 years with my hand still out. No one spoke. What is there to say? His mother made these, Emeric went on after a while in a steadier voice, because he had decided to finish it. After, there were 4 of us he'd carried over the years, 4 men who'd have been washed out or worse if Tobias hadn't stayed up in the dark drilling them, or gone back through a bad door, or done one of the 100 things he did that no one ever wrote down. His mother found out about all of us. And she took the iron from the old gate of their yard, the gate he used to swing on as a boy, she said, the gate his father hung, and she cut it into 5 little crosses at her own kitchen table with her own hands, and she gave one to each of the 4 of us, and she kept the 5th for herself. His name on every one, his name and the date and 2 words. He held it out then on his open palm, so we could all see the letters cut so small and so carefully into the rough iron. Under TOBIASRENN and the date, the two words were these: "Still here." "That's what she said when she gave it to me," Emeric said. "She held my face in both her hands, and she said, as long as one of you is standing, he's still here. And I've stood every watch since with him against my chest. 6 years. He stood every one of them with me. That man tried to throw him on the cobblestones and call him scrap." He closed his hand around the cross. "That's what he snatched. That's what was around that man's neck next to his gold. A mother's whole heart, cut out of an old gate with a kitchen knife, because her boy went back one time too many for men he wouldn't leave behind." I have thought many times since about how close that iron cross came to lying broken on the cobblestones under 100 careless feet, and about how the man who nearly did it never once in the whole of it understood what his hand was on. That is the thing I keep returning to. He looked at the most precious object in another man's life, and he saw scrap. It was not that he chose to be cruel about something he understood. It was that he could not see it at all. His whole world was surfaces, gold, chains, the size of a room, the number of phones pointed at his face, and a thing whose worth was invisible was, to him, worthless. I think that is the truest thing about men like him. It is not that their hearts are hard. It is that they have trained themselves to see only what shines, and so the things that matter most pass straight through their hands like water. I should say a word here about the 4 others, because they matter to what came after, and because they were the part of the story the world did not yet know. Emeric was one of 5 men Tobias Wren's mother had given a cross to, one of the 4 he had carried, plus herself, and the other 3 living men were scattered now across the realm, out of the service, gone back to ordinary lives, each of them carrying his own small piece of the same old gate against his own heart. Emeric had lost touch with 2 of them over the years, the way men do. A third he still wrote to at the turn of every year. They were not soldiers any longer. One kept a small farm. One drove a delivery lorry through the gray towns of the north. One had a bad leg from the very door Tobias had carried him back through, and walked with a stick, and did not talk about the war at all. But every one of them, Emeric said, still wore his cross, and would till he died, because Marta Wren had held each of their faces in both her hands, and said the same 6 words she had said to Emeric. And there is no man alive who can hear those words from that woman and ever take the iron off again. I tell you this because when the footage went round the world, those 3 men saw it too. They saw a stranger snatch the cross off a soldier's neck and hold it up and call it scrap, and every one of them knew, at once, exactly what it was, because they had its twin against their own skin. And though I did not know it that first week, and Emeric did not know it either, the snatching of one cross had, in a single afternoon, reached out and touched all 5, had put its hand on the whole of what Tobias Wren had been, and on every man who still carried him. That is a thing worth understanding about what Denny Vasco did. He thought he was taunting one silent soldier at a gate. He had, without the faintest idea of it, insulted 5 men and a mother and a dead man all at once, and 4 of the 5 were the kind of men who go back through burning doors and would remember. But I am getting ahead of the story, because the story did not end at the guardroom bench that night, and the loud man was not finished with us. Far from it. If he had crept away and licked his wound in private, this would be a smaller tale. Instead, he did what such men do when the world has, for once, told them no. He decided the world had made a mistake, and he set about correcting it. I should tell you who he was, now that you have seen the worst of him. His name was Denny Vasco, and he was, in the small, ugly kingdom of his own neighborhood, a person of consequence. The kind of man who lends money at cruel rates and collects it with crueler methods, who owns 3 shops that never seem to sell anything and a great deal of property no one can trace, who buys the loyalty of frightened people and calls it respect. In his world he was a giant. He walked through it certain that his name opened doors and closed mouths, and for the most part it did, because the people around him had learned that the cost of crossing Denny Vasco was higher than they could pay. He had never in his adult life been told a plain no and made to keep it. That, I think, is why the forecourt undid him so completely. For 1 hour in front of the whole world, he had been small, cautioned like a shoplifter, out-argued by a child, out-willed by a soldier, and carried off a public square by bored men who did not know his name and would not have cared if they had. He could not live with it, so he came back. Not himself at first. He was not that foolish. The morning after, while the footage was already climbing across the whole waking world, the snatch, the asterisk please asterisk, the child's clear voice, the catch of the wrist, Halloran's salute, all of it cut together and passed hand to hand across 100 million screens. Denny Vasco sent his thin, nervous friend, the one who had held the phone, back to the forecourt to find out the guard's name. It was not hard to find. The footage had names attached to it within a day. The whole world knew by then that the guard was Corporal Emeric Vale, and that the cross bore the name Tobias Wren, and that a mother had cut it from an old gate. The story had become, overnight, something people wept over on trains. And Denny Vasco lay in his big house and watched his own face be hated by millions, and it did something to him that a wiser man would have feared. He decided the cross was the problem, not his hand on it, the cross itself. If the cross was so precious, so beloved, so able to turn the whole world against him, then the cross was a kind of power, and Denny Vasco understood power the only way he had ever understood anything, as a thing to be seized. He convinced himself in the twisted arithmetic of the humiliated that if he could get the cross back, buy it, take it, make the soldier hand it over, then he would have taken back the thing that had beaten him, and the balance would be restored. It is madness, of course. You cannot buy back your own smallness. But he did not know that, and so the second act of the whole affair began, and it was uglier and quieter and more dangerous than the first, because the first had happened in the open where the crowd could see, and this happened in the shadows where Denny Vasco was used to working. The thin friend came to the railing 3 days running, and each day he tried to speak to Emeric, and each day Emeric stood his post and did not answer, because a member of the public speaking to a sentry gets exactly the same nothing as a member of the public shouting at one. But on the 4th day the friend did not come to the railing. He waited instead by the small side door where the off-duty guardsmen leave at the end of a watch, in the ordinary clothes of ordinary men, and he stepped out in front of Emeric on the public pavement, where Emeric was no longer a sentry, but only a tired man walking home, and he said his master's message. I was with him. We walk out together, the two of us, most nights, so I heard it. Mr. Vasco wants to make it right, the thin friend said. He would not look either of us in the eye. He had the hunched, flinching manner of a man who has been shouted at by the same person every day for years, and against my own will I felt a flicker of pity for him. He knows he made a mistake. He's a generous man when you know him. He wants to buy the cross, as an apology, whatever you want for it. He said name a number. He said any number. And he held out an envelope, thick with the ugly certainty of cash. Emeric looked at the envelope. He did not take it. He looked at the thin friend for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was not angry, it was almost kind, which was worse. Tell him it isn't for sale, Emeric said. Tell him the men who could set its price are not able to be spoken to. Tell him I said that. He paused. And tell him gently, because you're afraid of him, I can see that, and you shouldn't have to carry his messages, tell him to stop. For his own sake. Tell him to stop while stopping is still a thing he can do. The thin friend went white. He put the envelope away, and he said in a rush, in a whisper before he lost his nerve, he won't stop. You don't understand him, he never stops. Please just take the money, please. It'll be worse if you don't. And then he turned and half ran down the pavement, a frightened man carrying a refusal back to a man who did not accept refusals, and Emeric watched him go with a look I had not seen on him before. That poor devil's more trapped than we are, Emeric said quietly. Come on. We walked the rest of the way in silence, and I found myself thinking about the difference between the two men, between Emeric, who had every reason and every right to be angry and was instead only tired and sad, and Denny Vasco, who had no right to anything and was consumed by a rage that would not let him rest. It is a thing I have noticed, over the years on the post, watching the arrogant come and go. The men who have earned something are quiet about it, and the men who have earned nothing are loud, and the loudness is not strength but its opposite. It is the sound a hollow thing makes. Emeric carried the heaviest thing a man can carry, a friend dead in his place, and he carried it without a word, tucked under his collar for 6 years. Denny Vasco carried nothing but his own vanity, and it was so unbearable to him that he would tear a grieving man's heart out in public, and then send men to do it again in the dark, sooner than sit for 1 hour with the smallness of himself. I did not pity him, but I understood, that night walking home, that the whole story was really only that, the difference between a man who can bear to be small and a man who cannot, and what each of them does about it. "Do you ever wish you hadn't caught his wrist?" I asked Emeric before we parted. "That you'd let him throw it and just gone over the railing after it, and to hell with the post?" He thought about it honestly. That was his way. He never gave you the easy answer. "Every hour of that afternoon I wished it," he said. "And I'm glad every hour since that I didn't. Because if I'd gone over that railing, the story the world would tell is a guard lost his temper and attacked a man and Tobias would be a footnote in it, a reason a soldier snapped. That's not the story he deserves. He never once lost his temper in his life. He went back through that door as calm as a man crossing a road. If I'm going to carry him, I have to carry him the way he was, steady to the last. The stillness isn't me being weak, Corin. The stillness is me being like him." He touched his collar where the cross lay again beneath the wool. "Good night. I have never forgotten that. The stillness is me being like him." I had stood 4 years beside the man and thought I understood the discipline, and only that night did I understand that for Emeric it was not discipline at all. It was love. It was the shape his grief had taken. Every still hour on the post was another hour spent being the friend he had lost, keeping steady the way Tobias had been steady, so that some part of that steadiness would go on existing in the world. And a stranger had reached across a railing and mistaken the deepest love in a man's whole life for an empty red statue's blank indifference, and had grabbed at it and called it scrap. I do not think I have ever been angrier at anyone than I was, quietly, walking home alone that night, at Denny Vasco, and Emeric, who had far more cause, was not angry at all. We reported it, of course. You do not keep such a thing to yourself. Sergeant Halloran took it up the chain, and the chain, being what it is, took it seriously. An approach to an on-duty guardsman by an associate of a man cautioned for an offense on palace ground is not a small matter, and there are people whose whole work is to notice exactly that kind of pattern before it becomes something worse. Emeric's route home was quietly changed. A watch was put discreetly on the side door. And for a few days it seemed that the machine had done its work again, that the same system which had closed around Denny Vasco in the forecourt would keep him at a distance now, and that the whole affair would fade the way these things fade, into a viral clip that people half remembered, and a lesson a cruel man would refuse to learn. But I have told you that Denny Vasco did not accept refusals, and I have told you that the humiliation had turned into something like madness, and both of those things were truer than we knew. He did not send the thin friend again. He understood dimly that the direct approach had failed, and so he did what men of his kind do when the front door is barred. He looked for a softer way in. And the softer way he found was the cruelest turn of the whole business, because it did not aim at Emeric at all. It aimed at the dead. Here is what he did, and I set it down plainly because it should be remembered exactly as it happened. Denny Vasco, unable to buy the cross and unable to take it, decided that if he could not have the thing he could at least have the asterisk story, that if the world had made a saint of a soldier over a piece of iron and a mother's grief, then he, Denny Vasco, would find the mother, and he would go to her with his cash and his charm and his ugly certainty, and he would buy from her the right to say that he and the Wren family were reconciled, that all was forgiven, that the whole thing had been a misunderstanding between friends. He would launder his humiliation through a grieving woman. He would make her, without her ever understanding what she was doing, into the instrument of his rehabilitation. And then he would release his own footage of the meeting, and the story of the villain would become the story of the penitent, and Denny Vasco would win after all. He found her. That is the thing that still turns my stomach. It was not hard. The name Tobias Wren was known to the whole world by then, and a man with money and no scruples can find an old woman's door in an afternoon. Her name was Marta Wren, and she lived alone in the same gray town the two boys had come up from, in a small house with an old iron gate at the front of it that had a rough gap in the middle rail, where 5 little crosses worth of iron had once been cut away. And one gray afternoon, a big man in an expensive coat, with gold at his wrists, knocked on Marta Wren's door with an envelope in his pocket and a photographer waiting in a car across the street. We did not know it was happening. That is the hardest part of telling it. While Denny Vasco stood on Marta Wren's step, Emeric was on watch at the east gate, 100 miles away, standing his post in perfect ignorance, the fresh gray cord of his cross knotted carefully under his collar. The system that guarded him could not guard her, because no one had thought she needed guarding, because who would think to protect a bereaved old woman from a man she had never met and never wronged? There is a lesson in that, about the ways the cruel find the undefended edges, but I did not learn it until afterward, and I would rather not have learned it at all. What saved the day was the thing Denny Vasco could never account for, because it was invisible to him, the way the cross was invisible to him. It was the character of Marta Wren. He came to her with money and a rehearsed apology, and the assumption, the deep, lifelong assumption of his kind, that everyone has a price and everyone is a little frightened, and everyone in the end can be managed. He had never in his life met someone he could not buy or scare, and in Marta Wren he met, at last, a person entirely beyond his reach, because she had already lost the one thing whose loss he could have used against her, and grief that has been fully paid cannot be threatened. She stood in her small doorway, this old woman, and she looked up at the big man on her step, and she listened to the whole of his soft, rehearsed speech about reconciliation and misunderstanding and generosity. And when he had finished and held out the envelope, she asked him one question. "Which one were you?" she said. "Of the men my Tobias carried, which one were you?" "Because I made a cross for each of them, and I remember all their faces, and I don't remember yours." And Denny Vasco, who had a lie for every occasion, had no lie for that one because he had never imagined she would ask it. He stood there, and she watched him not answer, and she understood everything. "You're not one of the 4, she said. "You're the man from the square, aren't you? You're the man who tried to throw my son on the ground and call him rubbish." Her voice did not rise. That is what the photographer's own footage would later show. When it all came out, she never raised her voice once. "You've come to my house, to my son's gate, with money in your pocket to buy my forgiveness so the world will like you again." She stepped back from the door. "Get off my step. You're standing where the 4 of them stood, the real ones, the ones he saved, and you're not fit to. Get off my step and don't come back and take your money, because there isn't enough of it in the whole world." And she closed the door in his face. It should have ended there. A wiser man, or even a less broken one, would have understood that he had been beaten a second time, and beaten by something he could not fight, not a soldier's strength or a crowd's judgment this time, but the plain, unbuyable dignity of an old woman standing in her own doorway. But Denny Vasco had crossed, somewhere in those days, the line past which a man stops trying to win and only tries to hurt. He had told himself the cross was power, and now the cross had beaten him 3 times over, and the humiliation had eaten so far into him that he could no longer tell the difference between the thing that shamed him and the thing that would destroy him. He wanted, now, only to make it stop mattering. If he could not own the cross and could not buy the story, then he would ruin the meaning of the whole thing. He would find a way to make the soldier and the mother and the dead man small, the way he had been made small, so that his own smallness would have company. That is when it stopped being a story about pride and became, for a few dark days, a story about danger. Because a man like Denny Vasco, once he decides to ruin a thing, has instruments for it. He had money, and money buys hands. He put it about in the ugly little kingdom where his word carried, that there was a payment waiting for anyone who could bring him the guard's cross, the actual iron, off the actual man, and he did not much care how it came to him. He was, I think, no longer entirely sane about it. He had wrapped his whole battered pride around that piece of iron, and getting it had become, in his mind, the same thing as surviving. We did not know the bounty had been put out. Emeric walked his watches. The world, having wept over the footage for a week, had begun to move on to the next thing the way the world does. And into that lull, on a wet gray evening, two men came to the side door where the guardsmen leave, not the thin, nervous friend this time, but two men with hard, flat faces and their hands in their pockets, men who had been paid to take a thing and were not troubled by how. I want to be careful here, because I have promised myself to tell this plainly and not to dress it up as something more violent than it was, and because the thing that actually saved the evening was not violence at all. It was, once again, the discipline, the same discipline the crowd had mistaken for emptiness, the same discipline Denny Vasco had mistaken for weakness. Emeric and I came out of the side door together into the wet dusk, in our plain clothes, two tired men, and the two hard-faced men peeled off a wall and came at us with the quiet purpose of men who have done this before, and one of them said, "Lo, the cross. Hand it over and there's no trouble." And I felt the whole evening go sharp and slow the way it does when it is about to become something. And Emeric did not run and did not fight and did not hand it over. He did the third thing, the thing years of the post had built into him. He stood absolutely still. He looked at the nearer of the two men, level and calm, and he said, in a voice with no fear in it at all, "You've been paid to do this. I understand that. But I want you to think, for 1 second, about who you're doing it to and where you're standing." And he let the silence sit. "You're 20 feet from a royal gate. There are more cameras on this stretch of pavement than on any street in the country. There are men behind that door I could bring out with one word, and men on that roof you can't see, and every one of them knows my face and knows what happened last week. You've been sent to take the most photographed piece of iron in the world off the most photographed man in it, on the most watched pavement there is. Whatever he's paying you, it isn't enough for what happens to you if you touch me. Go home. Tell him you couldn't find me. Go home." I have thought since that it was one of the bravest things I ever watched, and one of the coldest, not cold like cruelty, cold like clear water, the total absence of panic in a man who had every reason to panic. He did not raise a hand. He simply made the two men see, the way he had made the crowd see, and the way Marta Wren had made Denny Vasco see, the true size of the thing they had walked into. And the two hard-faced men, who were dangerous but not stupid, looked at the gate and the cameras and the calm, unafraid man in front of them, and they did the arithmetic Denny Vasco had never been able to do, and they decided that no amount of his money was worth the machine they could feel closing in around them even as they stood there. One of them swore under his breath. And they went not fast, saving their pride, but they went back into the wet dusk, and they did not come back, and I heard later that they told Denny Vasco to keep his money and find another fool, because they were not going to be the men caught on 100 cameras robbing a war hero at a palace gate. Emeric let out a long breath when they were gone. Only then, only when it was over did I see what it had cost him to stand so still with his heart in his collar and two paid men in front of him. "That's the third time this week I've stood still and let it save me," he said, with a tired ghost of a smile. "You'd think I'd be used to it." Then the smile went. "But it can't keep being just me standing still. He's not going to stop. He tried to buy it, he tried to take it, he went to her door, now he's sending men. Each time it's worse. He'll keep going until he does something that can't be undone, to me or to her or to that poor frightened friend of his, and standing still won't cover all of us at once. Something has to end it, not me holding out, something that ends it. He was right, and the thing that ended it was not what either of us expected. It did not come from the shadows where Denny Vasco liked to work, and it did not come from a fight. It came from the very top of the machine, from the one place Denny Vasco's money and menace could not reach, and it came because the story of the cross had climbed, quietly, all the way up. King Alaric had seen the footage. Of course he had, the whole world had. But a king does not weep over a viral clip on a train and forget it by the next station. A king who is worth the name reads a thing like that and asks what it means and what it requires of him. And King Alaric, who had worn a soldier's coat himself long before he wore a crown, understood exactly what he was looking at. He understood the discipline in it, because he had been taught the same discipline. He understood the grief in it, because he had buried men of his own. And he understood, better than any of us on the ground, that a wrong had been done to one of his guardsmen at his own gate, and that the wrong was not finished, that a cruel and dangerous man was circling, and that the machine, for all its cameras and watch teams, had been fighting the thing defensively, one incident at a time, always a step behind. Denny Vasco kept finding the undefended edges. The king decided to remove the edges. He sent for Emeric, not through the long chain of it, sergeant to lieutenant to captain, but directly, quietly, in the way a king can when he chooses to. A word came down that Corporal Vale was to attend the king, and the whole guardroom went silent when it arrived, because such a thing does not happen to a corporal. Emeric put on his best and went, and I did not see what passed between them, and Emeric never told the whole of it, because he felt it was not his to repeat. But he told me enough. The king had the cross brought to him first, asked Emeric's leave for it, which is a thing, a king asking a corporal's leave, and he held the little iron thing in his own hands and read the name and the date and the 2 words, asterisk still here, and he was quiet for a while. Then he asked Emeric to tell him about Tobias Wren, not the public story, the one the world already had, the real one. And Emeric told him the gray town, the 2 boys, the recruit drilled in the dark, the bad door he went back through, the 4 men who came home, the mother at her kitchen table cutting an old gate into 5 crosses. And the king listened to the whole of it, the way I am told he listens, without hurry, as though there were nothing else in the world that hour that mattered more. And this man, the king said at last, this Vasco, he tried to throw it on the ground, he went to that woman's door, he has sent men to your gate. Yes, your majesty. And each time you have stood still and let it pass over you. It's the post, your majesty, a guardsman doesn't. I know what the post is, the king said, not sharply, but with the weight of a man who had stood it himself in his own young years. I stood it. I know exactly what it costs to stand still while a fool empties himself at your face. You have carried this correctly, corporal, and at some cost, and I am not going to ask you to carry it a day longer. A man cannot spend his whole life being the wall that a coward breaks himself against. That is not justice. That is only endurance. And endurance is your part, but justice is mine. He turned the cross once more in his fingers and gave it back, closing Emeric's hand around it with both of his own. Put him back where he belongs, this friend of yours, against your heart on your watch. And leave the rest to me. I have told you that Denny Vasco understood power as a thing to be seized, and that this was the flaw at the center of him. He thought power was gold and menace, and the fear on the faces of frightened people. He had spent his whole life among small powers, and mistaken them for the thing itself. He had never once, in all his scheming, imagined the real thing, the quiet, lawful, patient, enormous power of a whole ordered realm, which does not shout and does not threaten and does not need to, because it simply is, the way a mountain is, and which had now, because of a piece of iron cut from an old gate, turned the whole of its calm attention toward one loud, cruel man who had reached across a line he should never have crossed. It did not come for him with drama. That is the part he would never understand. He had wanted, always, drama, the crowd, the cameras, the noise, the sense of himself as the biggest thing in the room. The machine gave him none of it. What it gave him instead, over the following weeks, was the slow, total, unhurried arrival of consequence, from every direction at once, each thread lawful and documented and impossible to buy or frighten away. The caution he had shrugged off in the forecourt became, when the full weight of the evidence was gathered, the 100 phones, the child's testimony, my radio log, the footage from the side door, and most damning of all, the photographer's own recording of him standing on Marta Wren's step, which the frightened photographer surrendered the moment he understood what he had been made part of, a matter no shrug could cover. The approach to an on-duty guardsman, the bounty put out among his associates, the 2 men at the gate whose faces the palace cameras had captured cleanly, and who, once found, were entirely willing to say who had paid them and why rather than carry the weight alone. All of it, thread by patient thread, was drawn together into a single unhurried reckoning. And the ugly little kingdom Denny Vasco had built came apart at the same time, from beneath. That is the thing about a man who rules by fear. He is safe only so long as the fear holds, and the fear holds only so long as he seems untouchable. The footage of him being cautioned like a shoplifter, out-argued by a child, refused by an old woman on her own doorstep. It went everywhere, and it went into the very neighborhood where his word had been law, and the frightened people who had paid him and flinched from him and called it respect watched him be made small, over and over, on every screen they owned. And a man who lends money by menace cannot afford to be laughed at. The moment the fear cracked, everything he had built on it began to crack too. Debtors found their courage. Witnesses found their voices. The careful, invisible structure of his little empire, which had stood on nothing but dread, discovered that the dread was gone, and without it there was nothing holding any of it up. I will not pretend I felt sorry for him. I did not, but I will say that watching it, I understood at last the full shape of what he had done to himself in the forecourt that first afternoon, that when he reached across the line and hooked his finger under that gray cord, he had not stolen a piece of iron so much as he had, in a single greedy motion, tied his own whole life to a thing whose meaning would out him to the world. He had wanted the cross to be scrap. If it had been scrap, none of this would have touched him. It was because it was the opposite of scrap, because it was a mother's grief and a dead man's honor and a friend's 6-year vigil, cut small into iron, that it was strong enough to pull him down. He had grabbed hold of the one object in the world with the power to undo him, and he had grabbed it in front of everyone, and he had called it rubbish while he did. The reckoning itself came in a plain room, in the ordinary daylight of the law, with none of the drama Denny Vasco had always fed on. He had wanted, his whole life, to be the biggest thing in the room. In that room he was the smallest, a defendant, one of several matters on a long list, his gold left at home because gold does not help you there, his menace worth nothing in a place where menace is exactly what is being weighed against you. And the evidence was laid out, unhurried and complete, and there was nothing in it he could shrug off or shout down or by. Emeric was called. He came in his uniform, immaculate, and he stood the way he stood at the gate, still and level, and he told the plain truth of what had happened at the east gate that afternoon, in the same plain voice he had used to tell it in the guardroom. He did not embroider it. He did not ask for anything. When he was asked to describe the cross and what it meant, he did it in a few simple sentences and no more, and the plainness of it was, once again, what undid the room. You could feel the whole plain daylit place go still as he spoke, the way the forecourt had gone still, because there is a kind of truth that silences a room no matter where it is spoken. But it was Marta Wren who broke every heart in it. They had not required her to come. She was an old woman, and it was a long journey, and no one would have thought less of her for staying home. But she came. She came in her good coat, with her son's name on a piece of iron against her own heart, for she wore the 5th cross, the one she had kept, the twin of the one Denny Vasco had snatched, and she asked quietly whether she might say something, and she was allowed to. "I don't want anything from this man," she said. She stood very straight, this small woman, and her voice did not shake. "I've been asked what I want to see happen to him, and the truth is I don't want anything to happen to him at all. I'm too old and I've lost too much to have room left over for wanting people harmed. But I was asked to say what the thing was that he took, and I'll say it because he called it rubbish, and I won't have the last word on it be his." She reached up and lifted her own cross out from under her coat and held it in her open hand, and it was the twin of Emeric's, the same rough iron, the same small, careful letters. "My son went back through a burning door for men who weren't his to save, because he could not leave them, because that was the whole of who he was," she said. "He got them all out. He was the last one, he didn't come back. And I took the gate he swung on as a boy, his father hung that gate, the year Tobias was born, and I cut it into 5 little crosses with my own 2 hands, and I put his name on everyone, and I gave them to the 4 men he carried, so that as long as one of them was standing in the world, some part of my boy would still be standing too. That's what this is." She closed her hand around it. "That's what that man took off Corporal Vale's neck and held up in the air and called Scrap. He held my son up in the air and called him Scrap." She looked, for the first time, directly at Denny Vasco. "I'm not angry at you," she said. "I feel sorry for you, because you looked at the most precious thing I have left in the world and you couldn't see it. You held it in your hand and you couldn't see it. I think you've spent your whole life not being able to see it, whatever it was, in whoever's hand it was. And that's a poorer life than mine, and I've lost my only son." And then she sat down, and the plain daylit room was as silent as the forecourt had been. And Denny Vasco, who had wanted his whole life to be the biggest thing in every room, sat with his eyes on the floor and could not lift them, because for the first time in that life he had been made to see the thing he had held in his hand, and it was too large for him, and it had crushed him at last. What became of him I will tell you briefly, because he had already stopped being the point of the story, and he would have hated that more than any sentence. The many threads of it were resolved together: the offense at the gate the bounty put out, the men sent, the whole ugly campaign against a guardsman and a grieving mother, and the law did its unhurried work, and Denny Vasco was made to answer for all of it in full, and the little empire of fear he had built came down around him for good, its debts forgiven, its frightened people freed of him, its careful invisible structure gone as though it had never been. He was not harmed. No one in the whole affair was harmed from first to last. That is the thing I hold on to, that Emeric's stillness had held all the way through, and that the only thing broken in the end was a cruel man's illusion of himself. But he lost the one thing he had built his whole life to have, which was to be feared, and to be feared is a poor foundation, and a man who has never had anything else has nothing at all when it goes. He was made small and made to stay small, and the world moved on and forgot him, which was the exact fate he had always dreaded most and had earned. The thin, nervous friend I have not forgotten, and I am glad to tell you he came out of it better than he went in. When the structure came down he was, for the first time in years, no longer anyone's frightened errand boy, and it was he, I learned this later, who had quietly seen to it that the photographer's recording of Marta Wren's doorstep reached the right hands, because some last unbroken part of him could not bear what he had been made to help do to an old woman. It was not much. But it was the truth told when telling it cost him, and it counted, the way the child's clear voice in the forecourt had counted, and he was treated gently because of it. Emeric had said, that night on the pavement, that the poor devil was more trapped than we were. I like to think he is not trapped now. Marta Wren went home to her small house, with the gap in the iron gate. But she did not go home alone, and she did not go home to the same life. Emeric went to see her, took the long journey to the gray town himself, on his first free day in his plain clothes, with the cross that had been snatched back safe against his heart. I went with him because he asked me to, and because I wanted to. and I watched him stand on the step where Denny Vasco had stood in the exact place, and I watched the difference between the two men be the whole of everything, one who had come to take, and one who had come only to sit with her a while and speak her son's name aloud in her own kitchen, at the very table where she had cut the 5 crosses. She made us tea. She showed us the photographs. She laughed once at something Emeric remembered about Tobias, a real laugh, the first she had let herself in a long time, I think. And when we left she held Emeric's face in both her hands, the way she had done 6 years before, and she said the same words again. As long as one of you is standing, he's still here. And Emeric, who had not wept in the forecourt with his heart torn out in front of the world, wept then quietly on an old woman's doorstep, and was not ashamed. And the 4 crosses found each other, in the end, which is the part of it that still moves me most. When it all came out, when the full story ran, the mother at her kitchen table and the 5 little crosses cut from one old gate, the 3 other men Tobias had carried did what I have told you they were the kind of men to do. They came. The farmer left his farm to another's hands for a week. The lorry driver took his leave. The man with the bad leg came slowest of all on his stick from the far north because he would not miss it. They came to the gray town and they came to Marta Wren's door, and for the first time in all the years since the burning door, the 4 living crosses stood together in one room, with the 5th around the neck of the mother who had made them all. They had never been together before. There had been no occasion for it, and grief does not make appointments. It took a cruel man's greed to gather them. That is the strange arithmetic of the whole thing, that Denny Vasco, reaching only to wound, had somehow reached instead to draw the scattered family of the dead man back into one place. Emeric said it was the only good thing the man ever did in his life, and that he did it without meaning to, and that this was somehow exactly right. I was not in that room, but Emeric told me of it, and I have carried the picture of it ever since. 4 grown men, none of them young now, one on a stick, standing in an old woman's small front parlor with their crosses out over their shirts, and the old woman going from one to the next, holding each of their faces in both her hands the way she had done the day she gave the iron away, and saying to each of them the same words. As long as one of you is standing, he's still here. And now there were 4 of them standing in one room at one time, and so, for that 1 hour in that small parlor, more than at any moment in the 6 years since Tobias Wren was, in the only way the living can manage it, entirely present. His whole self gathered. The men he had saved in one place wearing him, his mother among them. It is the nearest thing to bringing a man back that this world allows, and it happened because a fool grabbed at a piece of iron and could not see what it was. The king did one more thing, and it is the thing I will end on because it set the whole matter right in a way that will outlast all of us. He decided that the small unofficial cross, the token that had never been permitted by the uniform, that the sergeants had for years politely pretended not to see, he decided it would be permitted. Not only Emeric's, all of them. He ruled, quietly and permanently, that a guardsman might carry, over his heart and beneath the wool, a personal memorial token of a comrade fallen in service, and that no one might ever again order him to remove it or lay a hand upon it, because a man who has agreed to stand still and carry the whole weight of his grief without spending it has earned the right to carry it where he can feel it. It was a small ruling. It changed almost nothing that anyone could see. And it meant everything, because it took the thing Denny Vasco had tried to call scrap and wrote it forever into the honor of the whole guard. And there was a ceremony, not a large one, the king has better sense than that, but a real one in a quiet courtyard, with the 4 men Tobias Wren had carried home standing together again, only weeks after they had first gathered in his mother's parlor, each with his own iron cross cut from the same old gate, and Marta Wren in the place of honor, and Emeric among them. The king came in person, and he did the thing he had done in his private room, only now in the open where it could be seen and remembered. He asked Marta Wren's leave, and he took Emeric's cross in his own hands, and he read the name and the date and the 2 words aloud, so that everyone present heard them. Tobias Wren. Still here. And then he gave it back, and he came to attention, this king who had once been a soldier, and he saluted, not Emeric alone, but all five of them, the four living and the one whose name they carried, the whole of it, the going back through the door and the not leaving men behind, and the mother at her kitchen table, and the 6 years of standing still. A king saluted an old gate cut into iron. And there was not a dry eye in the courtyard, and there was not one there who did not understand, finally and forever, that the smallest thing can be the largest, and that the men who cannot see it are to be pitied, and that the men who can are the ones who hold the world up. Emeric is back at the east gate. He is there most days, beside me or beside another, under the tall bearskin, white-gloved hands on his rifle, eyes on the middle distance that never changes. The tourists photograph him the way they photograph the stone lions, and they do not know, most of them, that they are looking at the man from the footage, and he would not want them to. Under the wool over his heart on a fresh gray cord, the little iron cross lies warm against his skin, and it is permitted now, and no one will ever take it again. Sometimes, when the crowd is thick and the phones are up and some loud man leans over the railing to see if the statue will break, I think about that afternoon, about the 2 words a stranger tried to throw on the cobblestones, and the child who named the theft, and the sergeant who saluted a corporal, and the old woman on her doorstep, and the king who came to attention before an old iron gate. And I think that Denny Vasco was right about one thing, in the end, though he never knew he was right and never will. He said it over and over as they carried him off, as though it were the last defense he had. All this over a bit of scrap. All this. A cruel man undone, a frightened man freed, a grieving mother's dignity made law, a whole guard's honor rewritten, a king brought to his feet in a quiet courtyard, all of it, all this, over a rough little cross cut from an old gate with a kitchen knife, no bigger than a thumb, with a name on it too small to read. That is not scrap. That is the only thing that was ever really worth anything at all. And Tobias Wren, 6 years gone through a burning door for men he would not leave behind, is still here, against a soldier's heart at the east gate this morning and every morning, standing his watch with the rest of us, and he always will be as long as one of us is standing.